Hello YouTube, this is Morgan Airspeed Prime here with my next Avatar discussion topic video. In this video I want to talk in depth about the sort of extra books in the Avatar universe. So not the Dark Horse comics or a lot of the stuff we really clearly see as canon, but I want to talk about these other books that get brought up occasionally, but for the most part, like, people aren't overly familiar with. You know, the legacy books from Inside Editions, the Lost Scrolls type stuff, and other books that are sort of like that, and just where we stand with them in regards to their canonicity. But before I get into the discussion, I do want to mention something, an update on the channel, which is that I have now activated channel memberships on my channel. You'll notice below all my videos and on my channel that there's now a join button. And if you click that, it gives you access to some options where you can help to support the channel financially. So you can see here when you open up the join menu, you get access to some of the details here. There's the Light Spirit tier, which is the €1 tier. And then the bottom there's the Avatar tier, which is the $5 tier. And the main thing to talk about here is these loyalty badges and exclusive emojis, which the loyalty badges will appear next to your name in the comments section, and then it will change after a year. So if you remain a member for a year, it'll change from the blue arrow and white background to the white arrow and the black background, and you'll always be able to use these emojis that I made in the comments. So I made one for each element, and I'll be able to make more as I get more members. So it's just a cool, fun way to help support the channel. If you click the join button, it tells you all of the details about everything that's available at each tier, but I just wanted to mention it here at the start of one of these videos. So yeah, let's get into this topic and why I decided on this topic, which is ultimately about this book, An Avatar's Chronicle. And a point that gets brought up occasionally, I think I've addressed it maybe on Twitter at one point before, but I've wanted to make a video on this for a while, and it just slipped out of my head a few times. And that is that occasionally I see people who grab this book, read it, and are very confused about a certain thing that this book says. And this is the point I'm making with this, of like, this is an official Avatar book. It's licensed, it says Nickelodeon on it, there was a decent amount of hype going into it, so people trust what it says to be true and canonical, yet there's a blatant continuity error here, and there's no real way to say it otherwise. So in the section towards the end of the book where Korra is talking about the villains, in the section about Unalaq, she of course addresses what happened to the past lives. Now, it should be noted, the context of this book is that this is meant to be an in-universe book that Korra is writing to leave behind for the Avatar after her. So when she says you, she's talking about the Avatar after her, who will be reading this. So she says, "As Unavatu, the Dark Avatar separated me from Rava and severed my link with the past Avatars forever." Correct? Which is why I must write this all down for you today. While I know that we can't let our failures define us, I am sorry that you won't have the connection with me, with Aang, and with all the lives that you've lived before. What? That doesn't make a lot of sense. It's correct in the sense that the Avatar after Korra will not have the connection with Aang, or the past lives before Aang. But why does it say that the Avatar after Korra will not have the connection with Korra when she is the present Avatar? She did reunite with Rava and has that connection back. And the mere fact that the cycle will continue, she knows there will be an Avatar after her, how is it not the case that that Avatar will be able to contact Korra? That doesn't make a lot of sense. And the thing is, this was never stated anywhere. Mike and Bryan have never talked about this. None of the writers have ever talked about this. The whole point of that Rava plot point of her being destroyed and then the reunion happening again was to highlight that basically the Avatar cycle has been reset. Korra is now sort of the new first Avatar of this cycle. Wan was previously. And they'd obviously established that Korra was able to contact with Wan. That's why we got the beginnings backstory, was because she still ultimately is able to connect all the way back to the start. So it's not a thing like the first Avatar is always left out. So so there's no real reason why Korra should be left out of the future Avatars, like, at all. there might be some sort of a technical point about the fact that Rava comes back in and is reunited with Korra, but she would forget about the first, 18 years of Korra's life, and would maybe only be keeping track of things after that point. But over the rest of Korra's life, I suppose a lot of that stuff will, Korra and Rava, their connection, it'll just come back into kind of circulation again. So I don't even think that adds too much complexity to it. This is just, in my mind, the writer of this book interpreting the book and what happened wrong, and then writing it down here in that way. And what it highlights is just that, yes, this is an official book, but is it the highest level of canon possible in the Avatar franchise? Not really. And the reason behind that is because who's the creative team on this book? Is it any writer? Is it Mike and Bryan? No. Did any of them have any involvement in this book whatsoever? Probably not. Now, if you look at the credits in this book, at the start it just says, text by Andrea Robinson and original illustrations by Sora Medina. That's pretty simple. It's just that, yeah, the entire text of the book was written by one person and the illustrations were done by another person. That's fine. Then you get at the end of the book that, okay, there's a few more people involved in this. There's a publisher, there's an associate publisher, creative director, designer, senior editor, editorial assistant, senior production editor, and production manager. All Inside Editions people. So no real credit to like, oh, and Mike and Bryan, ex-writer from the show, assisted us with this. So where are they getting the text from? Is it just the writer that they trust knows Avatar well enough and that they just write what there is? Because, let's be real, this book, as well as Legacy and Legacy of the Fire Nation, they don't really feature like new information. You probably get more information just from the new illustrations of the characters, like Legacy featuring some of the characters when they're older, Legacy of the Fire Nation doing the same, and some nice images of the Korra cast in this book. So the artists, it's good art to see what's going on. The text is obviously where the problem is, because this is the stuff that gets noted down in the wiki as potentially being canon. It's the stuff that people read and assume is completely correct, and you have people on Reddit saying like, well, this is the case, this book says so. And the explanation is that like, oh yeah, this is just a licensed book, don't treat it as being as important as everything else. When we're in like 2020 or whatever, 2019, when these books came out, shouldn't everything be much more in line and correct, aligned with what we're actually doing here? How do they make mistakes like this? And the ultimate answer is that they don't really have feedback or coordination with anyone who like deals necessarily with the continuity. I suppose the best example of this is that a few months ago, the writer of the upcoming Avatar cookbook did an Instagram live stream where she talked in depth about the process of the book and how effectively, at least at this stage of the process, the entire creative team on that book is basically her. She is doing all the recipes, buying all the ingredients, she's the one coming up with the ideas in general. And the only real communication she has basically is just, I think she just in general said, with Nickelodeon. So she has to give feedback to Nickelodeon, but it seemed like that feedback was more of just, you basically can't have alcoholic drinks, and that the stuff in the book has to be ingredients that are accessible to people in the regions where the book will be sold. That sort of stuff. It didn't really seem like there was any sense that that feedback ultimately goes through to an Avatar writer to make sure that the flavor text that she's writing for each of these recipes, which is going to be in-universe content of the characters talking about these recipes, she just is the one writing them. And where is that in any way sort of looked over to establish if it's correct or not? And the impression you get is just that some person at Nickelodeon who is more looking at this from like a legal point of view to make sure the license is being used correctly also has to be the one who's also doing the sort of, yeah, that seems about right. So someone who maybe doesn't know the story as well probably looked at that passage from this book and was just like, yeah, I've seen Korra, that sounds about right. not realizing the major mistake that they just let through because they didn't go to one of the writers with the book about this. And that's just the situation here that happens with a lot of these extra pieces of material, where the best that these books are able to do is to add in these little extra, like, basically factoids, not even like even full proper pieces of information. You have books like Avatar Lost Scrolls, where you find out that, like, oh, like, autumn is the season where airbenders are at their strongest, and it's like, okay, that's never a plot point that's, like, ever really brought up in the show all that much, but I guess it's nice. You get that sort of stuff. You find out about that, like, here, look here, there are 36 levels of airbending, and Aang has only reached the 35th level. Okay, that's kind of cool. No detail in that, like, they never mention levels of airbending in the show outside of the tattoos demonstrating mastery. Why not add something like that in? And so it's like, okay, that's a cool little fact that is only really revealed in this book, but doesn't mean anything. And then you have, like, a similar style of book, because again, the writer of these was the one who wrote Legacy. You just have this situation where the information that we want can't come in any of these books, but people still consider them as basically being canon. And so you get a major mistake included here, and suddenly everything's all over the place. And this is the problem with stuff like Avatar Extras as well. A lot of people, fans, have probably seen Avatar on Nickelodeon, the channel, when they've aired the Avatar's Extras versions with the facts that come up on screen. And half of them are not really important, and there's a certain fraction of those facts that come up that are wrong, that are continuity errors, that we know are blatantly wrong. Like, Combustion Man is given this whole other backstory, when we know he has a very specific backstory. Stuff like that, and it makes it very difficult to compile what the actual facts of what these more minor pieces of content actually are, because you just get into the weeds on some of this stuff, where some of these little pieces of information are actually quite important, but are we ever going to come back to these in any way? You also have books like, say, these. Like, a lot of fans have probably never seen these two books before, but the junior novelizations of Korra Book 1. Books that cancelled before they went into Book 2. There was a Book 3, but they cancelled all the orders and stuff like that. It never got made. These books are just, you know, adaptations of the episodes, but because they're in novel format, there is a little bit of expansion in some parts, but they get some of the characters' ages wrong. Like, Jinora is said to be 11 when she's actually 10, and I think Milo is said to be 4 when he's actually 5 in Book 1. And it's like, okay, at least these books say at the start that, like, they are adapted by Erica David based on screenplays by Mike and Bryan. At least it says that, and that, like, okay, I guess the script that she worked off had information slightly wrong compared to the actual official information released. But it also suggests that by the time this book came out, no one had looked over it to make the connection of, like, that's wrong, that doesn't make any sense. You've got the ages wrong there, or this scene doesn't actually happen, or whatever. And it's just allowed through because ultimately it's just a licensing thing. This is not an important piece of content like, say, one of the actual story content comics, where they make sure that if it's not Mike and Bryan, then they have a writer from the show working on that book to make sure it's accurate and in line with everything else. That doesn't happen with these extra books, where they're allowed to just sort of fill things in with little facts all over the place, and so on. So it puts all these books in a kind of weird position where, like, do you recommend them to people because there is some new information in them, but then you have to warn them that, like, don't take everything you read as being, like, canon, but, like, use what you can and disregard what is blatantly wrong. And it creates this weird situation with canonicity, where a lot of people will cite that, oh, you know, the trading card game. Every card has a piece of flavor text on the bottom that reveals a little bit of information about the world, or in the case of the new characters, new things about characters that we didn't know about before, like Malu and Afiko. as well as like Kinto and Jojo. We learn stuff about these characters who aren't actually in the show. They're only in the trading card game, only covered by the cards. They don't appear anywhere else. And most people disregard the trading card game as canon because of an interview where Mike and Bryan basically just said that they didn't work on the card game. When the exact same point is true about these three books. The exact same point is realistically true about this. It's true about the Avatar extras and a lot of other stuff as well in Avatar. So is canon as simple as whatever's canon is what Mike and Bryan say so? Then why are certain books allowed to be official books that feature canonical information or not? And you get that weird situation where, surprisingly, the cards don't really have any continuity errors, but they do actually feature quite a bit of new information. The only place details about the Air Nomad genocide is actually covered is through the new characters in the trading card game from like 2005, 2006. But everyone will sort of jump out of their skin about these books and like, oh look, it's cool, look at all this art and these new pieces of information, when there are continuity errors in these books and Mike and Bryan also aren't involved. And it's just this weird situation that we have when the level of care and attention given to the comics or stuff like that isn't given to everything. And this is going to, I suppose, be especially important as we go into this new era where Avatar is being quite heavily merchandised. Everywhere, every company is getting the Avatar license. The amount of action figures, statues, merchandise that's being made is pretty crazy. And we're getting stuff like screen comics in a couple of months. Canon-wise, they don't really matter too much because they're just adapting the show itself. There's no real problem there. But say then you have stuff like the tabletop game that's coming out, the sort of D&D style Avatar game that's coming out. That's going to have whole books featuring Avatar information. How canon or not is that stuff going to be? Obviously there's going to be a level of kind of game rules over a lot of the actual lore and details, but they're going to have to use some of that details themselves, and how much of that is canonical or not. And that's what we just have to, I think, be careful of going forward, is that, like, just understanding that a lot of the times, more so than the product being official, what matters actually more is probably the creative team and the people behind it. How much approval and oversight is given on a lot of these books, on a lot of these products. That is more of the situation with regards to really determining how canon or not stuff is. Because, you know, otherwise we get into this weird situation where, like, are we really prioritizing something Mike and Bryan said in an interview over a relatively official, kind of one of the major releases of the year, like when it came out? That's always felt kind of weird to me, that Mike and Bryan just offhand comment in an interview is kind of almost regarded better than an officially licensed book. Obviously for the reason that Mike and Bryan didn't work on these books, but, you know, that sort of a situation. Now, I suppose you could make the point of, like, maybe the Avatar's Chronicle is correct about the way the Avatar cycle works going forward, but I think 95% of fans are going to agree with my analysis that I gave earlier on and be like, no, the book made it pretty clear the Avatar cycle has been sort of restored now, it's just we've lost what we had before. It doesn't make logical sense that Korra is going to die and reincarnate basically into the new Avatar, but apparently be forgotten in the process. That doesn't make a lot of sense, even though Rava's there connected with her. It just would be a blatant, like, disregard of information we learned about in book 2. So you just get that sort of stuff that's kind of really awkward and annoying and frustrating about, you know, referring to some of this stuff. It's sort of the same with a lot of the information from the old Nickelodeon website, where, again, I doubt Mike and Bryan wrote every single line that went up on the Nickelodeon website, but a lot of that information is actually quite good, quite interesting, but it doesn't really exist anymore. It's like only there on the wiki. And this is why one of the things I've always advocated for is I think we need some sort of an encyclopedia type thing. Just to sort of act as a sort of, okay, let's clear the room here. This is what is and is not canon. This is the little bits of information we're bringing in going forward, and this is the information we're disregarding. They kind of need to do a little bit of a clear out on that stuff. Now, it's getting very into the small details here of, for the most part, information that doesn't matter all that much, but still, it is messy at that level, and sometimes those minor details are quite important, but it's just a point of, I would never argue with someone on the basis of something that I necessarily read in one of these books too badly, especially specific scenes. The same goes for like Lost Scrolls, and like especially what I found always kind of weird, some people really heavily use like the adaptation from a character's perspectives that are in these books as like a real insight into their character, when look, this is obviously a case of the writer read those episodes, watched those episodes, and just wrote the same episode from the perspective of one character. They didn't have any extra insight into that character to write that. They just like went with what they felt. And so Mike and Bryan didn't really give feedback on that, did they? So where does that fit? And it's just these kind of weird situations when it comes to where we stand on a lot of these books. And that's why for me, when it comes to canon, it's basically less Mike and Bryan said this, Mike and Bryan said that, and more, does it fit in canon with what we know? If so, yeah, bring it on board. Does it not fit with what we know? Disregard it. That's my view on canon as it is right now. More so than anything, just because I want to be able to utilize the most information possible rather than the least information possible. And so rather than waiting and hoping for Mike and Bryan to make a statement about this book or that book, I'll just go like, no, I'd rather have the information than not have the information, but know when to sort of disregard it or not. That's just sort of the point I want to make here. So in the comments, let me know what your thoughts are on all this sort of stuff, about just I suppose very specifically on that point, and that line in this book. How do you think that sort of came about, the full situation with regards to it? How wrong it is? And just where do you stand on how you view, when it comes to canon, continuity, a lot of these extra books that aren't the Dark Horse comics and so on, stuff like the trading card game and stuff like that, that's more obscure. Where do you land on a lot of that stuff, given that Mike and Bryan can't be involved in everything, but when they're not involved, stuff tends to slip through the cracks, and some stuff is correct, some stuff is wrong. Where does that go with all that sort of stuff? So the final thing I'll say is just that, look, I'd still recommend, say, like these 3 books. I think these are actually quite good in terms of a lot of the extra stuff. These are great, but primarily for the art and the fact that these books specifically come with the inserts and stuff like that. Like the fact that you get the letter and stuff like that you can pull out and read. That's cool. More of the just physical experience rather than the text and information contained within the book, which is fine, but leaves itself open to some of those little errors and stuff like that. And some people will say, oh, it's really nitpicky to do this video, but it's like, there should be an expectation with a franchise that is now expanding going forward with Avatar. Look at all the merchandising that they're doing. Like I said, Avatar Studios, if it gets too big too quick, do we run the risk of continuity errors really breaking into things? We shouldn't with the main projects, but this is where we do need to be a little bit more careful with, say, Inside Edition stuff, and that stuff that doesn't really seem to get the same level of oversight. I wouldn't be too worried about the comics or the novels necessarily, but that sort of stuff is where the problems tend to come in. So that's been the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.